They never told us what happened to the original Spanish teacher, and of
Well, I
course
hope
they
she
keep
made it
stuff
out
like
all
this.
right.
She did not. She did not.
I used to read those books when I was a kid, and they would scare me so bad that my parents actually had to take them away from me so I couldn't read them and scare myself anymore.
You don't want to give out information to somebody where to find a random fucking elementary kid, you know?
Welcome back to Awkward Purgatory. What do we have on the plate this week, Will?
Well, tonight, guys, we're going to talk about Penpal, which is a very well known online horror story. It was originally posted as a single story to r slash no sleep by 1000Vultures. I actually have the novel version here. Um, so, yeah. Originally, the author did not know that he was going to have a continuation, but people liked the first story, Footsteps, so much that he kept posting.
It was good. It was so good.
I definitely enjoyed it. I don't listen to creepypastas very much, but I did have it had a nice cozy creepiness to it.
It was a little confusing at first for me, but that's because I didn't realize it was originally posted as a subreddit. Once I understood that, I kind of understood the flow of it. It was out of order, which made it a little bit more intriguing,
Hmm.
and I did not see the ending coming. So that was really good.
Well, there's a lot of videos already online that break down the story in its entirety. I kind of want to start this off by doing something just a little different. I want to pose a question to you guys. And that question is, were there any events in your own childhoods that you could sort of parallel to the events in this book?
It's funny you say that, man. This actually created a little bit of trauma for me reading the story because there was something similar that happened to me when I was young. When I was 10 years old, I befriended these two sisters, Tony and Wendy. They lived in my neighborhood in Castleberry, Florida. I had just met them. I think their grandmother lived across the street from me. I think I knew them for 2 days. And then they were tragically murdered by somebody who was renting a room from the grandmother. He actually ended up being a friend of my stepfather at the time. He'd come through my house many times. Literally was at my house the day before. He killed these one of the girls and the grandmother, tied up the other one. She managed to live, but the whole story was it brought a creep to me because it reminded me of this situation I had when I was 10. So
So you were 10 when this happened. Were you aware fully of all the events, or did you learn more about it later?
um, I learned about it probably 2 days after it happened. I didn't know
And they just
who it.
straight up told you, like, oh yeah, they were killed,
I
or one
was
was
I was
killed.
smart at 10 years old. I knew
Yeah.
how to find stuff out. My mother would never tell me stuff like that, but um, actually the mother of the narrator in the story kind of reminded me of my mom a little bit. How she tried to hide things because we had a lot of stuff going on in our childhood that I found out later on as an adult how messed up that really was. Um, no, the guy who committed the murders was a friend of my stepfather's. He used to come through the house all the time, smoke weed with my stepfather. I remember that clearly. I was a little afraid of the guy. He was kind of weird and creepy. I mean, he was a nice guy, but he was just weird and creepy. He gave you that creepy vibe. And I guess he went off one day, was partying all day, took a couple, like 10 hits of acid, and then went and murdered two people right across the street from my house. So I do remember it pretty vividly.
How are
And
we supposed to follow that up?
well, I'm going to follow it up like
Yeah.
this. I think that one of the most powerful aspects of this book, this series of stories, is the fact that it's all pretty believable. A lot of online creepypastas have to do with supernatural killers, curses, kids' TV shows, stuff like that. But this story, there's a realness to it where you feel like this could have happened to me as a kid. These events are plausible, at least some of the individual stories. And the fear comes from the fact that this will always be a horror that kids have to deal with through time. Just like an abductor, a crazy stalker. This is stuff that realistically happens on a day-to-day basis.
Mm.
But I do think some of the extent of it is a little bit extreme and probably very rare in real life. Just the length of time that it occurs over is pretty insane. Although I'm also a little bit shaky on the exact, I guess the exact sequence of events and how long there were between different stories.
Yeah, they're not in order either.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think the very first story was near the end of this whole thing.
I could tell one story. It's definitely not a one-to-one comparison or really a direct analogy at all, but just the idea of something happening when you're a kid and then you don't fully understand the importance of it. You might know that it was bad or that something bad happened, but it may take years before you really understand like just how bad something was. So an example for me would be, I don't actually remember how old I was, but I was probably in the 8 to 10 range when this happened. I was at home and it was just me and one of my older brothers that were at home. And he was asleep. I was up, it was in the morning, and I was laying out a bunch of all of our plastic animal toys to start some hours-long adventure with them when I heard a car pull up in the driveway, and then I didn't recognize the car. And so I went into sort of a hallway where like they wouldn't be able to see me in any of the windows. And they knocked on the door, and I just didn't go to it. And I waited for a little bit, and then they knocked on the door louder. And again, I didn't go up to it. But after the second knock, it had been a while, and I went back out into the living room to continue playing with my animals. I thought they were done and they had given up. Maybe just a salesman or something. But at our back window, where there's a sliding glass door, and all the blinds were open, I hear a rap on the glass, and it's this like, he was probably 18 or so. Of course, at my age, he just looked like an adult. But so there's this adult standing at the sliding glass door, can fully see me. I'm in the living room, and he says through the glass, he's like, "Hey, can you come help me?" And I was like, "I'm not supposed to talk to strangers." And he goes, "Well, I'm not a stranger. I know your family. I'm a family friend. I know your mom. I know." And he gave me like 3 names of my family members, and I did kind of recognize his face just a little bit. And I was
Were
like,
they correct names?
Yes.
Okay.
And so I'm like, okay, he knows the names of some of my family members, and I kind of recognize him. And I was like, "Why do you need in?" And he was like, "I need to go to the bathroom," which makes no sense in retrospect as to why he would drive to someone's house to ask to use their restroom. But at this point, I was just like, whatever, I'm going to let him in. I mean, I was a stupid kid. I don't know. So I let him in, and he asked where the bathroom is, and I point to like the kids' bathroom, basically. And he goes in there, and after like 3 seconds, he walks back out to the living room and says, "Do you have a different bathroom?" And I was like, "Yes, there is one other, and that one was through my parents' bedroom." And I just point him in that direction, and at this point, I went to get my older brother because I knew something was up. I didn't know what was up, but I knew something was off.
Can I interject? How old is your older brother?
Yeah,
at this time.
He 3 years older than me. So
and you said you were
if
8
I
to
was
10, so he's what?
Yeah.
11 to 13.
Yeah, somewhere in that range. So,
Okay.
you know, slightly more grounded in reality than me. So I went to get him, and I was just like, "Hey, there's this guy that I let into the house, and he's in mom and dad's bathroom, and he's being weird." So yeah, my older brother's just like, "What is going on?" So we wait, and we hear some like sort of some like clattering in the bedroom, and then he comes out and he's like holding something under his shirt, and he's like, "Hey guys, I wouldn't go in that bathroom for a while. It is stinky in there." We followed him outside or to the windows, and my older brother got his license plate number, and we called. I don't remember. We were gonna call the cops, but actually, a neighbor of ours called our landline and said, "Hey, those people that were just at your house were causing trouble down the street, and we saw them at your house." So we went ahead and called the cops. The cops were already on their way, and we were able to give the cops the license plate number, description of the guy, and they ended up catching him in a matter of like a half hour. They found the car, pulled it over, and they took my brother and I actually to identify them. They had him on the ground, like, or they kind of had him down low, but they like pulled him up as we drove past and was like, "Is this the guy?" And we were like, "That's him." All this to say, I knew obviously that he had done something wrong, and I very much felt like I had done something wrong, which I had, but I mostly felt guilty about what had happened. But it wasn't until years later that I really fully understood that that was a family friend who like knew us, and because he was in a rough spot and he was broke and needed drug money, he went to someone's house that he knew and didn't break in, but burglarized. He took money, my dad's gun, and what he thought was some valuable things, which actually weren't valuable. But yeah, I mean, that's just an example of something where it's like, yeah, I didn't understand like just how truly messed up that was. But yeah, he went to prison for a while. Good while.
And you know what the scariest thing about that situation is? If that would have been some creepy like stalker who just happened to know some of your family names, he would have just gotten in and abducted you immediately.
Oh yeah.
Did you ever have that thought?
Through childhood with how dumb I was. I definitely had the thought that that situation could have gone much worse. That theoretically I could have refused and he could have broken in and hurt me and my brother. Or it could have been someone who was lying about knowing us and could have kidnapped us. I mean, yeah, all sorts of terrible things could have happened.
Well, for me, there wasn't really a specific story that stood out to me in my own life that I could compare. It's more situational. So, for example, this overarching thought that I had throughout reading the entirety of this thing was the fact that I had so many childhood friends, like really close childhood friends, who I genuinely have no idea what happened to them at all. Like, the story even prompted me to kind of try to look some of them up. So I typed in a couple childhood friend names online, couldn't find a single thing. And the main character, who isn't named throughout the entire story, has this best friend, Josh, as you guys know. And Josh just reminded me so much of these like fleeting friendships that seem so close at the time, but 1 year, 2 year, 3 years later, you don't even know where this person is, what they're up to, or like if they're even alive. And I know that might seem a little ridiculous, when you're 13 and you haven't talked to somebody in 3 years, you're not thinking like, oh, they could be dead, but in reality, they really could be. And you just never know. These people I tried to look up, they could be dead, and it's not like somebody would have contacted me. They wouldn't be like, oh, you were his childhood friend 16 years ago. We have to let you know that he died. So you would realistically never know. So I kind of had this like nostalgic sadness, pain for the friends that I, stopped interacting with and never heard from again, because I will never hear from them again realistically. I live elsewhere. They probably live elsewhere. And those friendships were just fleeting memories. And, I hope they didn't get murdered. I kind of doubt that happened because statistically it's not super common, but it really made me realize that, again, the events within this story aren't super far-fetched, and they prey on those childhood fears and insecurities that we all have.
Actually, my first quote-unquote best friend for like 2 years, kindergarten and first grade, was named Josh.
Oh wow. So were you picturing that person while you were reading this or listening to this?
No, strangely enough, actually, I was picturing a different friend that I had for a longer period of time, whose name I will not disclose. I have no idea where Josh is, though. I hope he's alive.
Well, I kind of want to break this down story by story, if you guys are okay with that, so we can just get into the first story here, which was the original. The original post was Footsteps, and just to give a brief summary, that's where the main character, says that he sleepwalks sometimes. He'll wake up on the bottom bunk. He hears his heartbeat through his head on the pillow, and it reminds him of footsteps. And he wakes up in the woods, has no idea how he got there, and he eventually finds his way back home, and his mom and the police are talking. So that's just to kind of jog your memories about how that went. What did you guys think about the initial post? That's the one that sparked everything, and people loved it immediately. So what did you guys think about it?
Well, I think for being a Reddit post, it was very well written. It was almost novel-like, just reading it as it was. The story itself didn't really hit me until the part where she said that there was a note left with his name spelled wrong. And then it was like, oh, wow, there's more to this than just sleepwalking. I assumed it was just a story about sleepwalking. And then it kind of, like in the last moment, just escalated, and it opened my mind and said, wow, there's a lot of potential here for a great story. And then he went on and produced a great story. So it was a good starter, an aperitif, if you will. Uh, and you guys know me. I'm not a horror fan. I'm not into the genre, but this was very intriguing, very mysterious, and it hit me to a core. So I enjoyed it. The first story itself was good. Not my favorite one, but it was good.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very well written story, and I think that mystery and the intriguing aspect of it is one of its strong suits, where you come away with questions, kind of wanting more. Like, why was he left in the woods? Why wasn't he just taken? You know,
Yeah.
and why is he being targeted and things like that. I think that's part of why people were asking for more. I also think, I'm sure this writer wasn't the first person to come up with this idea, but sort of his framing of telling a scary story through the eyes of a little kid who doesn't know what's going on. I think that's a very, very smart way to tell a scary story, because you're sort of having to translate through an adult mind, like what this kid is thinking and what's actually going on. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I liked this one. This was obviously the first one that I read, and I read this story way back in the day, probably like 10 years ago. So I would say this definitely piqued my interest. It wasn't my favorite out of the bunch, but it created enough of like a drive to where I wanted to know how the story progressed. I can't say that I ever had any events in my life that I ever paralleled this. Like I never had sleepwalking issues ever. I kind of know what he means about like putting your ear to the pillow and hearing a heartbeat. I used to do that before. Like when I was a kid, I would think that it was just like some thumping sound within the house, and then I'd realize later, like, oh no, that's my heart beating. So that was a cool little thing. Yeah, I could relate that to my personal life, but I definitely never woke up in the woods and was like scared for my life.
One critique that I would have, and this sort of just goes for the whole series, is that I don't think that the first story ties in with the others very well. And I think it's kind of obvious that he didn't have the whole thing in mind when he wrote that story. And he sort of just used it as a jumping point for the rest of them, which is fine. But I think that maybe, I think there's still questions in the first story that the rest don't answer. And it just kind of sticks out a little bit.
That's true.
I disagree with that. There was a one of the other stories later on where with the birthday party, where he invites Josh to the birthday party, and he's talking to him and trying to figure out why they separated, why they weren't hanging out. He does say you left, but he also mentions before he leaves that he was sleepwalking as well. So it kind of hinted towards the that he was also being targeted by the same guy.
But it's definitely referenced. But
Yeah.
I guess there's two things that to me don't make a whole lot of sense. One is why this stalker, who is clearly extremely obsessed with our protagonist, why he would like just leave him in the woods after getting his hands on him. With
Yeah, I
later
couldn't figure
on
that out
when
either.
we learned what he did with Josh, and he did all of that just trying to pretend that he actually had the kid who he really wanted. Um, and it's like, well, if he got him, if he took him out of the house, and he was going into the house repeatedly, like, how was he doing that? Um, but the other thing, if I can remember it, oh yeah, is that when he comes back to the house, his mom, at least the way I remember it being written, his mom believes that he ran away. Um, like his mom believes the note, if my memory serves me correctly. And with the surrounding knowledge of everything that was going on with this stalker, I think the mom would absolutely have suspected foul play uh, with all that stalker stuff. You guys disagree?
I agree with both of you for different reasons. So I think that clearly, when first of all, the author's name is Dathan Auerbach, so I'll just call him that. I'll just call him Dathan. That's easier. So when Dathan first wrote Footsteps, obviously he had no idea that he was going to continue this story. So to your point, Alex, I do think that it can, like, it's kind of obvious that Footsteps was its own thing beforehand, but to Kevin's
Right.
point, I do think that he added enough references, like including the pool float, for it to end up making sense a little bit. I'm not saying that it's like a 100% just smooth transition into the rest of the story, but it does have a couple outs. For example, this is a grown man thinking back about events that happened like 20, 25 years ago, trying to piece them all together. As a narrator, he's not like 100% reliable just because he's even admitting himself he's just looking back on memories and he's having to talk to his mother to try to piece these memories together. So, with that in mind, there's clearly things that would have been altered by his mind being a child's mind at the time, and then also altered by the fact that he's trying to remember things from legitimately decades ago. So I don't think it's too much of a sin to where it just ruins the entire story. Like I can see some issues, but I do think it's tied in enough to where it certainly doesn't seem like it doesn't belong with the other stories. Like as a cohesive unit, it's fine. I know what you mean about the about Footsteps not being 100% tied in, but it's not too far removed to where it feels awkward.
Right.
Yeah, and also the stories were out of order, so it did get hard to correlate them into a time frame. But the story of him waking up in the woods actually happened before the story of the cat boxes. And I think it was the catalyst of what the mother found under the house that made them want to move, and that where she started to suspect foul play. At the time, I don't think she suspected foul play with the note until other things started happening.
Yeah, so at this point,
Perhaps.
unless you guys have anything else to say about Footsteps, we can go ahead and move on to the second story, which is Balloons. And this is the story where the pen pal is actually introduced.
This one was
Sure,
so
give us a
creepy.
synopsis.
So creepy.
So, Balloons is probably tied with my favorite story out of all these stories. Um, the narrator goes to kindergarten, and they have a project where they include their contact information onto a little note, and all of the students are going to tie that note to a balloon, and they're going to walk outside with the teachers, let the balloons go, and then whoever happens to receive the balloon with the note will be able to contact the school and essentially get in touch with this kid and be their pen pal. So it's supposed to be just like a fun little community outreach project, but obviously it has very nefarious effects here.
I mean, this makes me think about back in the day when I was in elementary school, where stuff like this wasn't a concern, that we get away with doing stuff like that. But nowadays, you wouldn't see anybody doing that. Um, Too many stories out there of especially giving out your contact information. You don't want to give out information to somebody where to find a random fucking elementary kid. Too many creepy guys out there. But this did remind me of when I was young, where we were so naive to the whole, kids being kidnapped and pedophile stuff happening, that I could see this happening back in the day. I could see it having bad consequences. So this story, I would say, I agree with this. Is probably my second favorite story of the group.
It's definitely very solid. I think it's very ominous to think about like this person who obviously had a lot wrong with their head. They just get a balloon out of nowhere, and it's like this friendly note from a child, and to him, in his screwed up mental state, it must have felt like he was so special, Like, I can imagine this person perverting in his own mind to think that, like, oh, I deserve to, like, I guess possess this child. I don't know exactly what his motivations were, but it's just like, it's such an unfortunate but also believable way for a stalker to begin to select a victim, I suppose. And there's also mentioned in this story, I think, you said Dathan?
Yeah, that's the author, yeah.
Yeah, Dathan.
But the narrator is not Dathan, though. Those are two separate things.
Oh wait, what's the character's name?
He's unnamed.
Yeah, he never really names himself.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, okay, I'll just call it our protagonist then.
Mm-hmm.
He says that he feels at one point like he's done something wrong. It's when he's showing the pictures to his mom, and she's freaking out, seeing that he's in a bunch of pictures, and he feels guilty, like he's done something wrong, but he doesn't know why. He just feels like he's responsible, and although I certainly kind of did know what I did wrong with letting someone into our house to burglarize us, at the same time there was that confusion of like, I feel so terrible, but I didn't do anything morally wrong. I just made a mistake, but I still felt super guilty about it. So I identified with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the Penpal thing is like a super creative way for an antagonist to come into contact with the protagonist. It's like sadly plausible. I mean, think about how many like extremely messed up, mentally ill pedophiles out there would actually seize the opportunity if they receive the contact information to a child. I mean, it happens all the time today within different ways through like social media, Instagram bios, like Snapchat, stuff like that. So this was just like the 1995 version of modern day pedophiles getting into contact with children. So again, I think this story up until this point is somewhat plausible.
There's still details that I would nitpick. They are nitpicks, but things like him not noticing for so long that these pictures he's receiving like on the daily all contain a small child in it, and the teacher's not noticing as well. But then like at one point he goes through and he's like, oh my goodness, I'm in all of these pictures. It's like, would everyone really have missed that? That seems to me unplausible.
Well, he does say a lot of the photos themselves were blurry, and that it took some time for him to realize what was going on with him.
They're blurry, but if you're able to tell on inspection that, there is a child in the picture somewhere, then there has to be some sort of like, okay, well, if you can tell that there's a child in it, then you can also tell that there's like a street in it maybe, or a school bus or whatever he's standing next to. And so I'm just imagining these teachers like day in, day out receiving a letter with nothing but a creepy, blurry photograph of a small child and being like, here you go. Here's your 30th.
And then giving it to that same child.
Right.
Well, it at least lets us know that this stalker is extremely motivated. And also, at the end of Balloons, the stalker makes his first contact within the novel with the protagonist and Josh when they're playing outside at the place they call the ditch, and they're hearing the robot in the woods, and he only realizes later that that was the snapping of a Polaroid. And also, I don't know if you guys remember, but this is the one that ends with the picture of the protagonist actually being placed in an envelope in his mailbox, which then prompts his mother to call the police when she realizes that there's no address or anything on it. It's just was placed there clearly.
That was a good one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no postage stamp. That did creep me out.
Mm-hmm.
Is this also the one with the snow cone machine?
I think so.
Was
Yeah,
it?
because in one of those envelopes that he sent off, he put in a dollar. He put in a dollar that said 4 stamps. And then him and Josh were out selling snow cones later because they both had snow cone machines, and they got the dollar back.
Yeah,
so it also tells me that the stalker actually came and bought a snow cone from him. Mm-hmm. So there was other contact there as well.
Yep. Even if we're wrong about the actual placing of the snow cone event, it doesn't really matter because the story's not told in order. But I thought that was a really creepy touch. How I missed that part in the synopsis, but the protagonist writes 4 stamps on the dollar that he includes with his Penpal balloon, intending for the person to pay for their stamps with that dollar.
Which is a crime.
Which is, it's defacing currency or whatever. But the stalker keeps that same dollar.
Is it though?
And then, you can't write on money.
But no, you can still spend it though. I don't think it's considered defacing unless you damage the actual bill.
Are we going to look up like the U.S. laws on currency right now?
I feel like we might need to now if we're going to debate that.
Well,
but
obviously,
because I see stuff written on dollar bills all the time.
All right, this murderous pedophile committed a crime by writing on a dollar. We can get that out of the way.
No, the kid wrote on the dollar.
Oh yeah, the pedophile should have reported.
I don't think you're allowed to at all.
Yeah, bro, the stalker should have reported the protagonist for writing on that dollar, I think.
Yeah, I should have done some time in juvie.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, anyway, the dollar that says 4 stamps on it gets returned to Josh and the protagonist at a snow cone stand. And also in that scene, the protagonist cuts his finger badly on the blade within the snow cone machine. And the stalker actually makes a comment. He says, like, "Oh, you guys are really putting your blood, sweat, and tears into this, aren't you?" And then laughs and walks away. But I think at this point in the novel, it's clear that,
That must be in the book only, because I didn't get that part.
Which part?
Where he cuts his finger?
I think that is just in the book because I don't remember coming across that.
Yeah.
Really? Wow. Hold on. If I could pull this up quickly.
I do have to say, since he's looking that up real quick, the guy that narrated this on YouTube, very, very well done.
Was it Mr. Creepypasta?
Because he even had the emotional... Yeah, Mr. Creepypasta.
Mm-hmm.
He even had the emotional range when it came to explaining things, and it was like I got so into it. It was really good. It was like a really good audiobook. But no, I don't remember the part where he cut his finger.
No, you're right. That was in Balloons.
Yeah, I watched the same. It was in Balloons, okay. But yeah, I watched the same video as you did, Kevin. I do not like audiobooks in general. I actually very, very, very few narrators I can actually listen to read a book. And I think part of it is because when I read a book, I pause a lot. I'm not an exceptionally fast reader. I kind of chew on sentence by sentence as I go. And when I listen to someone reading a book, I feel like I actually probably prefer them to read as like monotone as possible, really. So that it's just like information entering my brain that I can sort of process and like assign the emotion to it. And while Mr. Creepypasta did do a great job of assigning emotion, it actually lost me in a few places where like it would get intense and he would start reading so quickly. He would read so fast where it's like, and then I ran to the store and this happened and this happened and this happened. And my brain was like, hold on, like there's a lot going on. I need to like rewind the video and listen to this again.
Yeah. He did do that, but I think it was for, like I said, the emotional attachment and to give you an idea of, maybe a visual idea of what he's feeling at that moment. Because there were times where, like one line in particular where he's like, in the last story, I hate to jump ahead, but he gets a text message that says, "See you again soon." And when he's mentioning the last words he said to me were, "See you again soon," and just the inflection that he did on it, like it gave me tingles down my spine. It was just so chilling. I thought he did a great job with that. And
He did, and
yeah,
I don't want to say that he did a bad job. I think it was just a preference thing for me. I don't
yeah.
really enjoy narrated stories in general, and I really don't like when they're like so emotive. But that's just preference.
When I first listened to it, I
I
listened to the
kind of want
Mr.
to read back
Creepypasta
through it.
version. Well, if you want to borrow a copy of this, I can always give it to you. But we don't have to include this next part in the video. I just want to read it to you guys so that you can see what I'm talking about and try to see if you might have missed this when you heard the recording. But here it goes.
Mm-hmm.
So it says, as Josh held the snow cone out to the man, I saw our patron's eyes dart back and forth from the cherry red ice to my blood red hand. His expression changed from concern to amusement, and finally he said, "You boys sure have put a lot of yourself into the business." The man followed this exclamation with a guffaw so long and loud that I could still hear it when I went back into the house to show my mom what I had done to myself. So that wasn't in the online version? He didn't cut his
I
hand
don't
in it?
remember it.
Yeah.
You know, it probably is new
I
because
don't
I
think
know there's
so.
a couple editions.
I don't remember the part where he cut his hand, so maybe that wasn't in there.
Yeah, that must have been novel only, but either way, he clearly had a connection with a in-person connection with the stalker there.
And I don't need to borrow your copy because I'm probably going to buy my own copy. I like having books on hand, so.
Well, we are going to move on to the third story within the novel, and I have to say this is probably my favorite. It is titled Boxes. It has to do with the narrator's childhood cat, who he got after he broke his arm after a fall from the tree. And the fear with this chapter for me is losing a childhood pet, just in general. So it captured that fear for me. Like, even as a kid, I would see my family cats, my family dogs, and I would always have the thought in the back of my head, like, wow, I never want them to die. Because I feel like when you're a kid, when you're like single digit ages, your pets are assigned a lot more importance in your life to where they could be like your brother or your sister at that age. So this chapter has to deal with the cat getting away and coming back multiple times, and the protagonist has to move away from the house because his mom goes under the house and sees that somebody's been living there. So yeah, great stuff. What did you guys think about this chapter?
It was a good one. One of my favorites as well.
It's actually my number one favorite, but it's kind of funny because it's for a completely different reason than you will, where I actually didn't care about the pet aspect at all. And I
Heartless.
think part of that is,
You're heartless, man.
Heartless.
I don't know. I mean, there weren't any stories about the cat that made me like the cat. But I just don't have memories to draw on of childhood pets of having that kind of connection to a childhood pet. We had pets, but none of them were like a cat or a dog, something that a kid really, really latches onto.
Do you have like a turtle?
We had a boa constrictor, which was awesome, but I didn't really like have feelings for that thing. It was a snake. We had a bearded dragon which escaped into the woods, and honestly that kind of just made me happy. I was like, oh yeah, he's just gonna go be free in the wild, not understanding that he definitely died the first year in the wild. No way he survived. But what else did we have? Some fish, chickens. But yeah, I didn't really like latch on to the pet aspect. I actually latched on a lot more to just the fear in the scene when he's in the crawl space, which we can get into that in a minute. But yeah, I guess it was just the horror aspect of this story made it my favorite.
So this story was my favorite until I actually finished the story, and then my favorites kind of switched around. But I was this was more my favorite because of probably like you said, the way he felt under the crawl space, just the action and the energy and the whole fear throughout the entire experience is what made it my favorite. Plus, it was very well told, very well written.
And it's kind of two different types of fear happening at the same time, where there was the immediate danger fear, where, okay, he's in the crawl space. He is obviously feeling in some way trapped, claustrophobic, and his friend is upstairs walking around, and he hears other footsteps than his friends and realizes that there's someone else in the house with Josh. And Josh even says, like, he whispers over the walkie, says, there's someone else in the house. And of course, so that's your classic, like, horror movie terror, right? But at the same time, there's other things going on where he's making discoveries and realizing sort of the more stalker aspects, where, yeah, he's realizing that someone was living under the house. Actually, not real time. At the time, he didn't understand exactly all of the implications of what they were finding, but the reader, you understand. And having his clothes hung back up in the closet when he knows that they had been boxed up, and all of the Polaroids are up on the wall, and so yeah, it's sort of like you have that sinister stalker creepiness combined with immediate danger, horror, like hide from the person. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
I think this one's my favorite because of the twist at the end of the chapter. Just there's that little burst of hope where you think for a second the cat actually came back home and everything's fine, and then the protagonist rips the clothes away. He thinks Boxes is going to be right there, and it's just a walkie-talkie broadcasting the cat's final cries before it's presumably killed by the stalker. I mean, when I first heard that, I was like, whoa, that's powerful. That did something to me.
Yeah, when he ends that chapter with Boxes never came home, I was like, oh, you gotta be kidding me. That's terrible. I was in. It was good.
It's also very clever to name the chapter Boxes because it has to do with moving, and of course the pet is named Boxes.
Mm-hmm. At this point in the story, how do you guys feel about the mother and how she's reacting to these events?
I feel for her.
I mean, I think she's doing what any mother would do. I mean, you can't. I mean, between the ages of 8 and 12, kid's not going to understand that there's some guy, fascinated with him, stalking him, and possibly him being in danger. You don't know how a kid's going to react to that. So I think she did what any mother would do. Keep that information from him. It's just it makes for good storytelling too later on when she's recalling all this stuff and he is realizing that he's so naive to everything that actually did happen. So
yeah, one of the main criticisms with this story is actually the mother character. A lot of people don't think that she did the right thing, especially when she chose to move across town but not actually tell the protagonist that there was a man living under their house. But Kevin, I can honestly see your point, especially because this story probably took place, let's just say, the early 90s. I don't know, that seems like a good timeline. There was no iPhones or anything like that.
I felt like it was 90s, the way they were just sending off balloons to random strangers. It felt like this is predating the whole rush of all these pedophiles and whatnot. So It gave me that early 90s vibe.
Yeah.
I don't think she necessarily should have told him exactly what was going on. I think she maybe could have told him something as a replacement, something like someone tried to break into the house and they tried it multiple times, so we had to move houses. Like, to not tell him that anything was wrong, that it's just like, oh, we're moving out of the blue just because, and she's obviously stressed out and he doesn't understand why she's so stressed out. I think maybe she could have at least tried to convey that something was wrong. I also think maybe they should have moved further than walking distance from their old house. But
Well, they were moving anyway, so she couldn't really change that. They just moved quicker when she saw that there was a man living under their house.
Yeah, but like, well, correct me if I'm wrong. They do walk to the old house, right?
Yes.
From
he and
Josh's
Josh
house.
do. Okay, from Josh's
Yeah,
house.
from Josh's house.
Okay, you're right. Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know. I would be, if something like that had happened to me, honestly, I would be going to like witness protection program or something, like max out the security like across the country. I would take every measure to get as far away as I possibly could from where this stuff had happened. I mean, it's one thing to just have like someone deliver some creepy mail. It's another thing to find out they've been living in your crawl space. Like that's not. Yeah, I think I would have been a little bit more extreme in my reaction.
I
At the
guess
same time, they could just have the idea that it's maybe just this place. Maybe he just picked this house in particular. Maybe it's not that he's after my son. He's just stalking whoever lives in this house. So maybe that was the mindset when they moved so close. I mean, I agree with you too. If somebody was stalking me and I was scared for my life, I'd be 5 or 6 states over. So,
Demons always follow their
but
hosts.
I'm just thinking that was just probably the mindset that the mother had was, and it could just be practicality too. She's still working in the area. She can only find somewhere in the area, just not in that particular house.
Yeah, and you got to think, would an adult realistically think that, hey, these random clothes and stuff I found under my house are tied directly to the pictures I received in the mail of my son? Like, there's nothing to say that she would have immediately thought, okay, there's a man stalking my son, and that same man is also living under the house. And that's kind of just my interpretation, because I know that the story itself wants you to think that she immediately makes that connection. But if you think about it from just your own standpoint, like you wouldn't immediately go, okay, the pictures are directly connected to the stuff I found under my house. And when you think about, she's a single mom, not making that much money, trying to support herself and her kid, and she's already moving, I feel like maybe just moving quicker probably was her only realistic course of action.
I think that the police or I don't even know who it would be through the authorities can sometimes help people financially with situations like that. But I agree it would have been certainly very difficult to try to like move cross country. And I understand why she maybe wouldn't have, because yeah, it would have uprooted her job, everything. I mean, it's like completely starting over from scratch. Is a huge decision. To your point about her not really having enough evidence to actually draw the conclusion that it was a stalker living under her house, that's what she had found. I agree that like deductively she didn't have that evidence, but I think if we think of her mental state after having found evidence that someone has been taking pictures of her son like day in day out for a long time, and she has called the police, she was so afraid from this situation, and there's also been a situation where her son went missing overnight. She had to call the police, and then he emerges out of the woods. There's a strange runaway note and all of that. When she's obviously in a fragile and paranoid state by this time, so finding a bunch of weird stuff in the crawl space, I could imagine that being enough to set her off to just totally freak out and want to get out of there immediately.
Yeah, I can agree with that. And I think that's the way it was written. It was meant to be interpreted the way that you just said, so. All right, guys, the next chapter, Maps, involves Josh and the protagonist essentially trying to map out the woods that connect both of their neighborhoods. To navigate these woods, they actually have built a makeshift float, and they have to go across this lake, and they're actually documenting out on paper essentially how many dots it takes to get from place to place. And in this chapter, another character is introduced, Miss Maggie, who is an old woman neighbor who has dementia, Alzheimer's, and she plays a very crucial part in this story. So let's get into it. What did you guys think about this chapter?
Possibly my least favorite chapter, actually.
Really? Why's that?
I think certain aspects of it just felt a little bit like irrelevant, and sort of like they had just been shoved in as like an extra side story that doesn't really contribute anything. Like, I don't really understand why we need to have the assertion that the serial killer moved into the house next door, when we also know that he was like living in the crawl space underneath their house. Like, that sequence of events doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I also found the whole like building a raft thing a little bit implausible, especially with the circumstances that were going on and the fact that they were like allowed to just raft around. I don't have very good reasons for disliking it. It just didn't strike the same chord with me as the other stories did.
I thought the pacing was a little strange. I mean, maybe the online narration version is different, but at least in the novel, the narrator goes through and explains what actually happened to Miss Maggie's husband. Did that happen in the online version as well?
No.
The mom explains that he died, that he's not coming back, and she has Alzheimer's.
Okay, and that's really all that's
She
relevant.
doesn't
The,
remember
the
that.
book,
Yeah.
the book kind of goes into some filler about that. I thought the twist was somewhat creative. So to give a little bit more breakdown of the plot of this story, the pen pal sort of realizes that Josh and the protagonist are in the woods doing this map thing, and he encounters them, or at least we presume that it's him. So they're like shooting Roman candles at him, and they're running through the woods trying to get away, and they actually lose the map in the water. It sinks away, and they get back, and Miss Maggie is talking to the narrator only, and she always used to ask him if he wanted to come inside. So at this point, after he gets away from the pen pal, he's soaking wet from the water, just ran through the woods, was very afraid, and he asks Miss Maggie if he can come inside. And for the first time, she says no, and then she mutters something that he doesn't really hear, and then he runs home. And then at the very end of the chapter, police with hazmat suits are seen taking bags out of Miss Maggie's house, and the narrator's like, "Oh, I just remembered what she said. She said Tom's home," which was her husband, and obviously that's not the case. So it's just presumed that the pen pal got into her house and killed her potentially.
Yeah, it never
I
clarifies
agree.
that was the case. So we all kind of just put that together on our own.
Yeah, I think the implication is that she was chopped up because they were bringing her out in bags. But I agree that twist is great. I actually think that's a fantastic sort of basis for a horror story. It makes me think of, did you guys ever read Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark?
Yes.
It was just the collection of little short horror stories. I
I
love
think so.
those.
I don't remember it, but I think so because it sounds familiar.
They made a movie on it, incidentally, and it was horrible. But
It was bad.
very, very, yeah. I remember going to a big family cabin event, and we went down at night to the docks, and we were sitting on this dock on a lake, and my older cousins were reading these stories to me, and I was the most scared I've ever been, but I also felt safe because I had older people around me. So I just felt like happy to be included in what the cool cousins were doing. But yeah, I think that the use of Alzheimer's and the husband coming home, but the husband is actually the killer, fantastic. It just doesn't, to me, it doesn't add anything or really have a place in the overall story with our protagonist.
Again, I disagree. I'm not
That's
doing this
okay.
out of habit, but there might be small parts of the story that you probably didn't catch. Like this is the part where they lose the map. This is the part where some of his clothes are taken because he takes some clothes off and leaves them beside the lake, and he comes back and realizes that some of them are missing. They find them later in the story. This is also where I guess we'll call it the pen pal or the stalker, left something in his pocket. A little drawing with the two stick figures. was left in his pocket at that time. So I think this was my least favorite story as well, but just because it's my least favorite doesn't mean it wasn't well written. I thought it connected with the story very well. With the map being the main part of it, the drawing itself, the interaction with the pen pal in the woods, the story of what you call her, Miss Maggie? I forget her name.
Yeah, Miss
the
Maggie.
neighbor lady.
Sounds right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It did never connect the dots that it was the pen pal that was the one that moved in and killed her, but we kind of just assume it is because that's where the story's going. I think there were little parts of this story that did connect later on. But yeah, I agree. This is my least favorite one as well.
Well, the pool float is the same float that he sees in Footsteps. So I thought that tie back was at least kind of cool. The shark float.
Yeah.
I don't know if this was my least favorite. I thought it was clever. Like, it's too clever to me for me to say that I disliked it, just because, like you said, Alex, I could see this being its own standalone story for like scary stories to tell in the dark. And also, side note for that, I used to read those books when I was a kid, and they would scare me so bad that my parents actually had to take them away from me so I couldn't read them and scare myself anymore. So that's a nice little throwback. I used to love those
You would
things.
have liked to have nurturing parents.
How did that manifest? Like, how did they know that it was scaring you too much? Were you screaming or?
Because I was like an
He
8-year-old.
slept in his
finding
parents' bed
coward
till
in
the
your
age of
room.
15.
No. To my knowledge, I just wasn't able to sleep, and they would come in there at like 12 a.m. and I would just have the lights on, and they'd be like, "Why are you not asleep?" And I'd be like, "This picture in the book scared me."
Yeah.
And I
That
still
makes
remember
sense.
which picture scared me the most too. Not to get too much into that, but there was a story called like The White Wolf, and that freaking illustration like kept me awake for days. I don't know if you guys remember that story or not.
I'm gonna look it up. I'm curious which one.
Yeah, we got all the time in the world. Look up The White Wolf Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark image. That thing like traumatized me. And if you show it right now, I'm gonna have to cover my eyes. Dude, I could not sleep because of that for a long time.
It's definitely disturbed. I would say. Oh,
Hey,
I don't
Alex,
think that
send
one
that
would
to
have
me.
affected me. Oh, I can.
Or share it in
Second.
the group chat or something. And what Will's not telling you about the story is that time when his parents came in, the lights were on, he said he was scared. He was 19 at the time. Just playing.
Dude,
I just had a moment of fear where I thought I had sent that to my boss. Oh, good lord.
That is pretty good. I could see you being creeped out by that.
Anyway, let me get y'all's take on something with maps. So I think this story is probably the best at convincing me as the reader that it could have just been lost as a childhood memory, because when him and Josh are running through the woods away from what they think, they actually don't know what it is. So we don't technically know if it's the pen pal. And the Miss Maggie thing, he only realizes way later on what she actually probably said. All he knows definitively is that she died and she had to be taken out of the house. So I think Maps is probably the closest story to what I would believe is something that could just be lost as like a hazy childhood memory that you don't piece together until way later.
I could probably agree with that.
I like the story for the fact that the boy it showed the boys being naive and still doing the thing that teenage boys do or pre-teenage boys do, is going out in the woods and exploring, playing, making maps and stuff like that. Even with all the stuff that's going on in their lives with the stalker and whatnot, it was good to see a story that showed the naivete of the kids that age and how much they did not know what was really happening. Correct.
I do have a story that from my childhood that is sort of similar to this one, in a very roundabout manner. It's very messed up. I'm not even gonna no. Okay, I'm just gonna say it's messed up. Okay. in middle school, I had a teacher who all of us hated her. She was very grouchy. She was very, I'll just say she did not look nice or friendly. And we all did not like her. We talked bad about her. And at one point, she was absent because she was sick. That's what they told us. She's sick. And, a couple days turned into a couple weeks. And then eventually our substitute, they just had to find a new teacher. And they were like, yeah, she's going to be out for a long time. And I thought cancer. I knew cancer was a thing. And so my assumption was that she had caught cancer or something. But it was later on that I found out that she actually had anorexia. And she was actually actively starving herself to death while teaching our class. And that's why she was so thin and so grouchy all the time, because she was killing herself. So yeah, that one was kind of wild to find out later.
Well, I hope she turned out okay.
No, I didn't say that right at all. No, she had died. Yeah, I'm sorry. She
Plot twist.
Yeah, she died basically. She went too far. Like, anorexia is complicated, but I guess she got to such an unhealthy weight that she caught an illness and she wasn't able to fight it off. I don't really know exactly what actually was the nail in the coffin, but yeah, she was sick for a couple weeks and then she died.
Well, if she was anorexic, most likely died from dehydration. That's probably the number one cause. But usually, at that point, when somebody loses so much of their body weight and they're not eating, the body starts eating itself. Will probably know more about this. I know ketosis is when it starts feeding on the fat in your body. But once you run out of the fat in your body, what's your body start eating then to get energy? It starts eventually eating itself
Muscles.
in some weird way, So it was probably something like that killed her. But my guess would be dehydration mostly, because she's not getting enough fluids.
Well, R.I.P. to her soul.
I love how Will's like, I hope she's okay.
He literally didn't
no,
say that
wait,
she
no,
was
I
dead.
messed up. She died.
I totally
He
botched
said
that.
she was
Well,
sick for a couple weeks.
Yeah.
I was tiptoeing a little bit because I do actually find it kind of funny that we were like actively making fun of and hating on someone who was like on the verge of death. But
Bro, that's terrible.
it also feels wrong to find that funny. So
Kids are shitty people.
I know I am now still a terrible person, but
No, it reminds me of something that happened to me when we were young. When you're young and in elementary school and something like that happens, they don't inform the kids what's happening. I do remember we had in elementary school, don't ask me why we had a Spanish teacher in elementary school, but we had this old lady that was a Spanish teacher. Nobody liked her. She was so mean. She disappeared and got replaced by this younger, had I been a teenager, would have said sexy, hot, new Spanish teacher. But they never told us what happened to the original Spanish teacher, and of course they keep stuff like that.
Right.
She did not. She did not. Turns out that she was a victim of a murder-suicide, but they don't tell elementary kids this. So.
Wow.
Yeah,
Someone
her husband went crazy. Yeah, her husband killed her and then killed himself. And we didn't find this out. I think I was in middle school before somebody finally told me the story about it, what happened to her.
So the next story is called Screens. And this is the one that has to do with the narrator's teenage love with Josh's older sister, Veronica, and their terribly failed date where the pen pal essentially mangles her, incapacitates her. And yeah, so let's kick it right off. What did you guys think about Screens?
I wanted the narrator to have a happy ending. I so badly wanted him to be like, yes. I wanted it to be where he grew up and married the sister, and they've got pictures of Josh on the wall, and they're both recalling him. But of course, something bad had to happen to her, And the twist in this was amazing. This is probably one of my favorite stories. Um, the fact that he connected with her and got some information on what happened to Josh and everything like that, and then for her to get hit by the car, be in the hospital, for him to be by her side, and then to have her say, "All right, don't come back," and then he's texting with her, having this whole conversation with her, and when she goes, "I love you," I'm like, "Oh, it's gonna happen, it's gonna happen," and then to find out that she'd been dead for 2 weeks at that point, I'm like, this is getting to be very, very twisted. I cannot wait to see how this ends. So this, like I said, one of my favorite, probably my favorite story overall. Not my favorite part in the whole narrative of the story, but my favorite story altogether. Just how this played out and how it was written. Very, very, very good. My favorite.
This was not necessarily one of my favorites, but there were parts of it that I liked.
That's because you didn't have childhood pets and you have no soul.
Exactly. Well, I think probably the part of it that was most effective for me was just the scene where he finds the, sort of mangled body of what's the girl's name again?
Veronica.
Veronica,
thank you. When he finds Veronica and she's contorted, and he initially, I think he kind of just assumes she's dead. I mean, it almost looks like she would have to be. And then over time he realizes that she's actually alive, and he doesn't know what to do. He's telling her not to move. That whole scene, it was well written, and I can also just imagine what it would be like to be in a situation like that. It'd just be so horrific, and so I was affected by that scene. I think some of my criticisms for this story would be related to, again, the believability, and I'm probably way too nitpicky about like what I find believable and not. But for instance, okay, I can believe that he wouldn't have known about Josh running away permanently. I think it's unlikely, but I can believe it. But for no one to have told him that Veronica had died when he was visiting her in the hospital, and like his mom never even goes up to him and says like, "Oh, I'm so sorry about what's happening," or what happened. Like, I don't believe that he wouldn't have found out for so long. How do you guys
I think
feel
there's a
about
point. There's a point in the story where he's telling his mom about the messages. I've been texting with her for the last 2 weeks. She's like, she died that day you left. I thought you knew. So, again, I mean, this is probably her trying to protect him from things, but he was under the impression she was still alive. He was under the impression that, he was having a conversation with her, and the parents never stepped in and said, yeah, she died. I think there was a lot of lack of communication between mother and son at this point. At his age, she kept a lot of things from him. I think that was a huge twist in the fact that she was dead at that point in time as well. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I think I can personally believe that he wouldn't have known, especially if it was just a short amount of time, like 2 weeks. And he also has the reinforcement every day of texting who he thinks is Veronica. So, of course, he wouldn't think she was dead. I don't think there's any rule that says that people necessarily have to tell him. I mean, he wasn't even really close with Josh's family anymore at this point. He went to visit her. That's really about it. And then he never came back. I don't really think that they would seek him out to say like, oh yeah, by the way, she died. Maybe the family would just assume that he was told by someone else. His mother already thought he knew. So in terms of things that I can believe, yeah, that's perfectly reasonable that he wouldn't have known for 2 weeks, I think. Maybe there were a lot of signs. Maybe somebody even said Veronica is dead, but he was texting her, so he's just like, no, she's not. Like, I'm literally communicating with her right now. And there's just sort of like a disbelief or denial going on with that. So I'm not going to I don't think you're nitpicking because these are criticisms that I've seen online, but I'm not going to really count this against the story because I could see how that would be reasonable.
Yeah, people grieve in different ways too.
I suppose there are certainly worlds where that could have happened. To me, it just felt like it wasn't fully explained how that happened. But you can explain it. you guys both did a pretty good job defending it. Here's a different one that really, I think I would probably defend a little bit more. That I think that this is a bit of a problem with the stalker, is that at this point, by this point in the story, the main character is so much older than he was initially. What grade was he in when he sent out the balloon?
Kindergarten.
Okay, so we're talking about 10 years at this point, right? Between balloons and this movie theater date. There's so much to me.
Like 8 or so, I think.
Yes,
If he's 16,
because I think in the story he said he's 15 when he did the
15?
whole date with Veronica.
Okay, so
And
maybe
most
9
kindergartens
years.
are about the age of 5, so 10 years, 10
Right.
years.
That for this stalker to still be following him and keeping up with him and not to have found a new subject, I think that's highly unlikely. But it's not just because of the length of time and how like unfeasible that is, but also because the stalker is a pedophile, and by this point, after this kid is becoming an adult by this point, I just don't believe that someone who would select a 5-year-old as a target would also still be targeting that person at the age of 15. I don't buy that personally.
Well, I would probably not classify this guy as a pedophile. I think it was more of he was obsessed with this one particular child. Because I mean, there's never mention of him ever having other victims. I think he just was obsessed with this one child, stalked him throughout the entire life. Settled for Josh because I mean there was multiple times in the story where they say that Josh and the narrator are very similar. His mom even says, the only way I can tell you guys apart is your hair because they had different kinds of hair. I guess in general means he would be a pedophile because he was chasing a child, but he wasn't like attracted to children. He was just attracted to this one particular child. He was obsessed with this one child. He stalked and terrorized this one child.
I think I agree that
I don't know
that's
how you
how
classify
he
that,
was
yeah.
written. I think I agree that that's the way that he was written for the story. I just don't. I personally cannot think of ever hearing a real life example, and I'm not super read up on stalkers and serial killers, but I do consume a decent amount of content related to that. I don't think I've ever heard of a story of someone selecting a target as a very young child and following that target into adulthood. I don't think I've ever run across that.
Well,
It is unique, that's for sure.
I have, but with a slight caveat. There are people who stalk and kidnap children and then keep them in their basement and basically have them trapped until they're adults. Like there's people who have kidnapped young girls and kept them chained up in their basement, had children with them and kept them there until they were like in their 20s or whatever. Like Alex, to your point, I actually had the same thought. I'm like, if this was like a pedophilic attraction, would this guy really still care that much about the narrator and Josh when he's in high school, when they're both high school age? I really did have that thought. But I think, like you said, this character was more written to be like an obsessive stalker rather than having like a love interest, or I shouldn't say love interest, more than having like a sexual interest with the narrator. Because think about it like this crazy mentally ill messed up guy probably isolated guy gets a note one day that just falls from the heavens, and in his schizophrenic delusions he's like, oh, this guy wants to be my friend, this is my best friend, and then he just follows that kid forever. So when you look at it through those lens, I think it makes a lot more sense.
Well said, my friend.
Perhaps.
Donka.
Yeah, I mean, again, kind of similar to my other critiques, I do think there's generally ways to explain or to, kind of to make it work. It's just, for my experience, for my listening experience, like, there were flags going up in my brain that was just like, I was just losing the believability of the story at times. For just little things like that. But you did a good job defending it.
I appreciate that.
And it
Uh,
was still a good story.
well, one criticism I guess that I could cough up about the story screens was, why would the pen pal basically do a hit and run on Veronica? Like, what does that accomplish for his end goal of getting with the narrator eventually? I mean, I guess the only thing I could come up with was that he figured he could get access to her cell phone that way and maybe be able to contact the narrator like that. But, killing another child that he doesn't have a stalker obsessive interest in, just as a way to get closer to the person he's stalking, that seems like a little much. Like, that was something that I thought was a little. I mean, I think it goes good with the story, but like realistically speaking, I don't really see how he thought that would accomplish much.
I have an opinion on this.
Go ahead.
I think he saw Veronica as an obstacle. She was taking the position he wanted. He wanted to be with the narrator. The narrator was wanting to be with her, so he saw her as an obstacle. And when the narrator went behind the building to pee, he saw an opportunity. He took it to eliminate that competition so he could slide into that position. I think that's where his head was at when he killed Veronica. I mean, that's just how I took it. I'm not sure that's what the author was going for, but that's what I saw. I saw him taking her out as of rage, jealousy, just taking out competition.
I actually sort of agree with that because he receives the text from the pen pal who he thinks is Veronica at the time that says "I love you," and he says "I love you too." So I think you're right about that. He saw a love
Mm-hmm.
interest sliding in, getting in the way of his stalker obsession, and he took her out. I agree with that. All right, guys. Well, if you're both ready, we can move on to the final story within this series of events called Friends. And this is where we get the terrible, infamous conclusion to the tale. And I just want to ask you guys right off the bat, how did you feel about how the story ended?
I thought it was good. It was so good. Um, I mean, I think I felt something for the mom of both Josh and Veronica. How she just basically lost her mind because of the tragedy that struck her. I felt for the dad to be the one to actually find the body of his son with the guy that has been tormenting them all these years. That had to be tragic in its own way. But how they handled that whole situation, where he called down the narrator's mom, um, and how they took the body of the pen pal and they burned it on its own, and just the whole way he wrapped up the story was, I thought, very very well done. This is my favorite part of the story. As I said, the Screens is my favorite story overall, but this is my favorite actual part of the story.
I feel similarly about it as I did the previous two stories, which is that I think it was well written, and there were parts of it that did definitely hit home with me, but I also had issues just with believability of certain things. Um, like the fact that the father of Josh had been paid to fill in holes on a property that he was already doing site work on. And I work in earthwork a lot. And so I'm just like trying to imagine what the author possibly meant by this, and I really can't understand. And I have no clue how the stalker would have gotten a coffin into a hole and gotten himself and Josh into that coffin, and how Josh's father would have filled in a hole with a coffin in it without noticing. That to me, I have no idea how that happened. I don't understand.
I thought this was the best twist overall. I think you might be overthinking it and not just going with the narrative. I mean, I appreciate that about you, because I thought that too. I was like, how did he not see the coffin? The coffin. Please edit that part out.
I'm not going
How
to.
he didn't
Don't
see the
edit it out.
coffin. Yeah, I agree how he didn't see that, but the fact that he twisted the story to make it to where the father was the one that buried his own son with this animal, I thought that was a huge twist, never before seen. I didn't expect it myself. You know how I'm always trying to predict these horror movies and how they go. That was a really good twist. That hit me really, really. That hit me good. That was a good plot twist. Very good storytelling. Um, when he said I was paid by a man, that man right there, pointing at the guy in the coffin with his son, on top of being the one to find his son, and then realizing that you're the one who buried your son, that had to tear that guy apart. And emotionally speaking, I know I would be devastated. The fact that he took the body and burned it, I mean, it was all like retribution. And especially the part where he says, "Don't tell my wife. No, she doesn't need to know about this. She still thinks that he's somewhere alive." And I actually felt something from that. I was like, I can feel his pain through the words that this guy is telling me, because I have an idea of what that'd be like to be the one to find your missing son who's been missing for years, to find his body, to find a guy huddled up on him, holding him like he's like they're lovers, and then realizing who this guy is. He paid you to do a job that, ended up being the epitome of you burying your own child who was alive at the time. That makes for a great horror story. I thought that was absolutely perfect. But yes, there are parts where you're like, how did he not see the coffin? Why would he do this knowing that they're going to excavate it later anyways? I think he mentions that in the story. He's like, this guy's a sucker because he wants me to fill in these holes, but they're just going to excavate it in a week. But I needed the money, so he took the job. I thought that was
maybe
the best part of the story.
Like a really minor edit that he could have done that would make me think that little thing of him being the one that buried his son, that would make that like 10 times better, in my opinion, would be if the person who paid him, the stalker, had explicitly told him that he needed something covered up. Like, had been like, hey, like, and it had been a huge sum of money, maybe say like 10 grand, 20 grand. I mean, we're obviously there's different theories about if the stalker wanted to die in that scenario, or if Josh just managed to bite his neck off while he was trying to just bury Josh. There's different theories about that. But regardless, we can imagine that the serial killer could have a large amount of cash that he's willing to part with. And if Josh's dad had been presented with, $20,000 to bury a coffin, that could be a little bit more believable to me. Yeah, it's just the fact that it's like somehow he just didn't know. I don't know. That was just a little odd to me.
I don't know. I mean, maybe the $100 is more believable, because if somebody gave me $20,000 to bury a coffin, I'm like, what the fuck's in this coffin that he wants to hide, that he's willing to pay $20,000? Whereas if you give a guy $100 to just move some dirt around, you're like, okay, you guys helping me out with a small job. I mean, that seemed more believable to me. But I was actually thinking too, I'm glad that they twisted it this way, but when they first found him in the coffin with his son Josh, I was like, who the fuck buried him? Does he have an accomplice? I was thinking he had an accomplice or something. There's another guy where we got to find this other guy. And then for it to twist around and say, this guy paid me $100 to basically bury my own son, I was like, dude, that blew my fucking mind. And that's right when I texted you, Will, I said, wow, dude, this was a great choice, because I was literally, I had just got off of work. I was in my car. I had like the last 45 minutes to go on this, and I listened to it, sitting in the car with the car running, and it absolutely blew my mind. I had to text you immediately and say this was a great choice.
I appreciate that.
But I picked up on the plot holes too. I mean, you got to think this was some guy who randomly posted on some subreddit, so it's not going to be like a Pulitzer Prize novel, but I think for what it was and where it came from, it was really good.
Agreed. It was one of the better creepypastas I've read, although I've not read a whole lot, but yeah, it was great.
Generally speaking, I really do enjoy this series of stories and how they tie together. It's not a flawless job, but it's enough to make me, it doesn't ruin the immersion. I think that it suffers from something that the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise also suffers from, and it's the fact that it was created without any lore or an ending in mind. So the creators are having to come up with what happens as they go along. And those situations very rarely ever play out with a good ending, in my opinion. So I was kind of let down, a bit underwhelmed with the ending of Pen Pal. It's like Dathan Auerbach tried to do something like extremely disturbing and grandiose, but I thought it was a little just weird and unrealistic. And compared to the rest of the story, which I actually thought was pretty realistic, which is why I liked it. So I'm wondering, do you guys think the ending was fair?
I'll put it two ways. If it was me, I would have done it differently, for sure. Uh, that doesn't mean that I didn't find any value in it or that I think it's just outright bad. I think it was good, and I mean, it was certainly disturbing. Um, but no, if I had been in charge of creatively where it went, I think it would have been a lot less climactic. I think it would have been honestly more like frustratingly open ended, where like maybe the writer is unsure if he's still being stalked. Like over the years, there's been some weird occurrences that weren't enough to be like 100% this guy's still after me, but it's also like not really sure if I'm safe or not. That's probably what I would have done.
I thought the ending was great. Um, it's not your typical ending. It was unique, so I like it for that matter. The fact that the father found his own son, that was creepy in its own right. And then to find out that he was also paid to bury his son, I thought that was a great ending, a great twist. Not seen anything like that before, so I'm gonna say I enjoyed it. Um, I got a little confused because the stories were out of order, so a lot of the times I had to go back and listen to it again just to understand what was happening and where we were on the timeline. So I'm not a big fan of that part of it, but I also thought that was a unique way to tell the story as well. So I'm kind of on the fence on that part. But like I said, those are probably my two favorite books in the story, or favorite story in the overall narrative.
The last two?
The last two, yeah. Screens was my favorite overall story, and then the part where he found his son and they realized that he had buried his son was probably my favorite part of the entirety of the story.
But yeah, I agree overall with your take on it, Will. That I really enjoyed it. But I do think that it maybe lacked a little bit of direction. The most obvious is, I mentioned earlier that the first video, you can tell he did not have, or not the first video, I'm sorry, the first story, he did not have everything in mind of what was coming.
Yeah.
But really through the whole thing, you can kind of tell that it was just, he did a great job, but it does have that unneeded sequel factor to it. Like there's a lot of movies that they'll make a great first movie and then they'll make sequels to that movie because it did well. And if the first movie explicitly set up for a sequel, usually the sequel is good because they were planning to make one. But if the first movie stands well on its own and then they try to add on to it, almost invariably it's not as good. Like How to Train Your Dragon is one of my favorite animated films, if not my favorite animated film. And the second and third movies, I think, are completely and wholly unnecessary and just detract from the series. And don't even get me started on this live action thing that they're making. I can't even talk about that. But
I feel like you want to because that's the third time you've mentioned how disgusted you are by the live action of it.
I can't talk about it.
I guess one of the last things that I even have to say about this story is that while I was reading it, or while I was first watching it originally, I thought that the final reveal was going to be that the pen pal or the stalker was actually the main character's father, who is not mentioned at all within the story. I thought that would have been a very nice twist, and it would have explained why his mother was like so adamant about, not really, I mean, going to the police, but not really getting it solved like she could, and just doing things like moving across town to different neighborhoods instead of like really, really stopping the problem. I was like, wait, what if this is this guy's father? But I don't know.
Would the story have been as scary if that was the case?
I mean, the fear of the unknown would still be there up until the final reveal, so I guess technically yes, but if you mean the actual ending versus what I'm saying, I don't know. I guess it's debatable. I just thought that would make some sense and would have been kind of cool.
Okay.
Maybe what you guys are trying to tell me is I would just suck as a horror writer.
Well, no, I'm just trying to picture because if it was his dad, then you take away that whole ending, all of the last story. So, all right, let's do this. A hypothetical. If this was your story and it was his dad, how would you end this story?
Okay, give me some time to think.
Because obviously he's not going to kidnap Josh. He's not going to murder himself and Josh. So you'd have a completely different ending.
I think the ending, the reveal would never be like the actual father comes into the story and is like, "Hey, I'm your dad." Like that would never happen. It would be him talking to his mother years and years and years later after all of these events have happened, except for the events of Friends, and his mother breaking down in tears and being like, "That person that stalked you for a decade was actually your father." I don't know. It would have been cool.
Or he could have found out for himself, like maybe at some point he sees the stalker's face somehow, or learns the stalker's name through something.
And it's his
and
face.
and well, not his face, but then like, and then he goes and finds like the government record of his father, and it matches either the face or the name or something. Um, that it certainly isn't a climactic ending, but I must say personally, I generally prefer more open-ended endings. Like, and it goes for horror movies as well. Most of the time, when a monster is revealed, it's disappointing for me.
I agree with that. I really do think the same.
Yeah, so that's just kind of my perspective on horror.
And that's probably why I don't like the horror genre, is because they're so underwhelming sometimes.
Have you guys seen Barbarian?
No.
You've never seen that movie? Well, it's a horror movie that came out like 3 years ago, and the first probably 40 minutes I was watching it, and I was like, this is the best horror movie I've ever watched by a long shot. And then as soon as they revealed the antagonist, I was like, oh my God, this movie sucks so bad. So
I
I,
kind of
I
want to
get
watch
where
it
you're
now.
coming from. Dude, it's such a waste of time just for that reason.
Yeah, some of my favorite horror movies never show the evil thing, like Blair Witch Project. You never see anything. It's all up to your imagination what's going on in those woods. And to me, that makes it so that even thinking back on that story, it leaves me with a certain fear that probably wouldn't be there if like three-quarters of the way through the film they had just started showing like a witch or some kind of monster that was chasing them and stuff. It would be like, okay, this is a dumb horror movie. But as it is, it's like, you know, being in the woods of Appalachia sometimes can remind me of the Blair Witch Project.
Didn't that end with the camera facing somebody who's looking like in the corner or something, just kind of
Yeah,
dazed out, and then it just went black?
yeah. And they're
Yeah, she
screaming.
finds her friend in the basement of a house. He's like up against a corner naked, I think, and then she sets the camera down or the camera gets knocked out of her hand and then she gets dragged off or something.
Okay. I was trying to see if I remember. I haven't seen that in forever, so I was trying to see if I remember correctly.
That movie started the whole trope of like walking in the woods for hours just to end up in the same exact spot where you started. And when they did it, it was original and awesome, but now it's kind of cliche.
Yeah, that is used a lot, running across the same spot. It's like we've been
Yeah.
walking all day.
Well, guys, final ratings. What would you rate Pen Pal out of 10? We'll do it out of 10. 10 being the absolute best story of all time and 1 being terrible.
I give it a 7.5. Solidly enjoyable, but I wouldn't put it in, like, I don't think I'm gonna be thinking about it 10 years from now.
hmm I mean, I'm thinking about it 10 years from when I first heard it, but
Well, if I had read it at a younger age, it probably would have stuck with me more. Uh, like Ted the Caver is my favorite creepypasta, and that I read at a very young age, and I don't know if I would like it as much if I read it for the first time now. I probably wouldn't.
I'd probably agree with him. Go 7.5. Um, and that's good. I mean, it's better than I expected, so it got 7.5 because of that. But again, lackluster overall. So I think 7.5 is a good spot for it. Good call, Alex.
Yeah, I would probably say 7. I have really high standards for horror, so I'd say 7. Solid. But that's really good. That's a good score by me. Over average.
Have
Solidly over
you
average.
have you ever read a story that you would rate as like a 9 or a 10?
Yes. Yeah. Um,
Can you give us a name?
well, reading stories is a lot different because like are you including like Stephen King and stuff into this, or do you mean just like creepypasta tier
Uh,
stories?
I mean, I guess so. Yeah, I guess I would include Stephen King.
Okay. Yeah, I would say that Desperation is very close to a 10. I also really enjoyed Pet Cemetery, so I don't know if you've read either one of those.
I haven't. I'd like to read Pet Cemetery.
So, but when you think about it like that, I'm giving Pen Pal a 7, and I would say that Pet Cemetery is probably a 9, Desperation's probably a 9.5. It's not really that far. It does need a couple tweaks, and maybe if it was doubled in length and more detail was given to some things, I could see a 9. Like Pen Pal realistically with a rewrite, like maybe a 15th anniversary rewrite or something, I would happily change my score, raise it. But in terms of like creepypasta tier stories, yeah, there's certainly ones that scared me more, and there's been ones that were more enjoyable for me. I can't really think of any off the top of my head right now. Well, there is a story called My Dog Was Lost for 3 Days. What Came Back Wasn't My Dog, or something like that. And that really scared me at the time when I first listened to it. And that's a
That
good
title
story.
kind of scared me.
Hmm